This is Seeking Delphi, episode number 30, Ambient Science and Digital Twins. I'm Mark Sackler. The future lives here. The idea of ambient computing has been around for a while now, though just exactly what the definition is may be the subject of some debate. Suffice to say, it involves pervasive computing carried via the emerging technologies of high-bandwidth connectivity and the Internet of Things. It has the potential to be all around us, all the time, without us even being aware of it. But add to this the concept of the digital twin, defined by Wikipedia as a digital representation of a person or object, and things really get complicated. So much so that there's now an entire field to deal with the marriage of the two concepts called ambient science. One person very much concerned with ambient science is Katalin Bártfai-Walcott of Intel. Officially, her title is Senior Principal Engineer, Intelligent Silicon Architectures, and CTO, Ambient Science and Orchestration. And indeed, the issues surrounding ambient science may be as complex and, well, mind-boggling as that title. I recently put in a call to her in her California office. Let's hear what she had to say. Kati, thank you for joining me today, and welcome to Seeking Delphi.
Thank you very much for having me today, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be here.
To start out with, before we get into the whole question of ambient computing, ambient science, you started out as a geneticist. So how did this morph into being involved more as much with information sciences and Intel?
So I'm a senior principal engineer in Intel's data center division, and I focus on smart and intelligent resources and ambient science. Yes, my background is in genetics, but pretty much my entire career I've been connecting biology, biological sciences, and computing. So from a very early age, during high school, I was working with NASA Ames Research Center on a study with bee biology, looking at the how mitochondria would change due to lower microgravity conditions, and really trying to figure out what the impact of that is to the biological systems, especially for astronauts who are in space for a long time. And then when I went to UC Davis, I was connecting biology and computing by studying the decomposition and composition of bone due to gravity and gravitational situations, and we were trying to figure out what is the impact of gravity on bone. And I was modeling some of that in a computing system in the Department of Veterinary Anatomy. But as I moved to IBM and to Intel, I felt that there's an opportunity for biology and genetics from the concepts of small ingredients of computing versus servers and systems to really meet the need and meet the requirements of humans much more effectively if we bring in the concepts of recombination, of aggregation, of composition of components that are specifically detailing and describing the capabilities that are mapped to the services and the experience that we are trying to deliver, versus trying to assign systems and large complex machines to that task. So I believe that there is indeed a capability in the future of technology and a future of industry where biology and technology will connect.
We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in our interview here, but let's talk about the basic subject of what you are referring to as ambient science. Obviously, the term ambient computing as a concept has been out there for a while. So what is exactly ambient computing, and how is ambient science maybe something more than that?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, and thank you for the opportunity for me to explore this with you. When you think about ambient computing initially was really focusing on the computational systems that provided us with the ability to create a very effective human cyber interface. So when you're looking at ambient computing systems, some of the front end of this, which that you're seeing in your Amazon Alexa or your Siri, they are interfaces and systems which allow us to connect with these systems in a much more ease of use fashion. So ambient computing initially was those computational interfaces in the Internet of Things and the edge computing, which allowed this ease of use. What ambient science is doing is going one step further. It's actually focusing on the ambient experience. And the way that this is changing the paradigm of computing is that it is actually bringing humans into and providing a direct interface to computing by an immersive capability. And this is much more than immersive computing. It is really looked at as how we're going to combine human systems and computational systems at a level where they can start to work together and interoperate and communicate. And we do that through something that we're going to talk about a little bit later on, we call the ambient digital twin. So really the focus here is in ambient science is what are those elements that we need to bring together in order to enact and provide this experience in a way that doesn't require really any haptic or IO-based interfaces to interact with computing. So it's changing the concept from what you're used to in voice control or gesture control or keyboard control type system or even your mouse to the ability of interacting and constantly being immersed in a computational system is actually a kin member. And that a kin member is a representative of you in a computational system, representing your needs, your wants, your wishes, your rules, your regulations, and your policies in a language that you do not need to actually learn. It's a representation of you in that system. So in ambient science, we describe all of these elements. So we describe the management of data and the concepts around data logistics, data supply chain, and data stewardship. We also describe elements that are part of the legal and legislative elements as we are driving the use and management of the data and the representation of a human in a cyber-physical sense in a new way. We also look at this again from a biological perspective as how do we create that interaction, that seamless interaction between computational and biological systems in a way that really exemplifies and meets the need for the experience that the humans are looking for. We also look at the elements from a perspective of genetics because the systems which provide the experience don't have to actually be fully completed and fully consistent at the location where you're at. So when you're thinking about edge and fog systems, these are individual small elements which really need to understand how they work and how they exist, not just as individual units of compute, but also as a society and as a community that is there and can compose themselves in order to meet the need for the experience that they are invoked in and part of providing. So these are all elements of the ambient science structure. So it's much bigger than just ambient computing. Hope that answered your question.
It did in a broad sense, but maybe you could give some concrete examples of how this might work, how it might be experienced, and how it might be an aid to the typical person in the day-to-day life.
Let me give you a really simple experience. Let's start with, let's say, a home. You enter that home, and today through various different means and some amount of automation, you can adjust the temperature and turn on the lights and interact with your electronics, maybe start off your coffee maker. But each one of these interactions are one-to-one. So you're interacting with the light switch or interacting with the home automation system that is acting on certain commands and certain presets that you actually had to physically program in order to complete an action. It's really an if-then-else statement or a case statement or a while-true statement in a traditional sense of programming. In the future, the environment or the home that you would be entering would actually recognize you as an entity who is entering that home without any specific unique interaction between you and the house. And at the moment you arrive, you actually have a digital representation of you that actually arrives with you and starts interacting with the home in order to really be able to handle your specific needs. And those needs are really defined by this ambient digital being or ambient digital twin, which is an object that is representing you in the cyber-physical sense. Now, the home actually has a representation of an object or a ambient digital twin of itself as well. And these two digital twins have the ability to communicate at a layer that is really not known to humans. But they're also able to negotiate based on different terms and conditions and can handle the ability to manage the transaction at a much higher level. So in the future, when you walk into the home and let's say you walk in with your children and your husband, every one of these entities actually shows up and it's negotiating at this higher plane the requirements that are part of that home. And the end result of that is a common level of lighting, a common level of temperature, a common level of interaction with your electronics and the home systems that is negotiated between these objects without the need of the humans to fight over the light switch or fight over the thermostat. And that is providing an experience for humans that is different than what we can do today. But if we take some of the concepts of digital twins beyond the home, some of the other things that it can do, it can actually represent you on a much broader interaction outside in the world as well. So while you're at work, your digital twin could be negotiating on your behalf a purchase of a new car. Or it can actually handle the management and the payment of your bills. And this is not like what you're used to as the agents or the automation we have today on setting up an automatic payment. It is actually representing and pulling together the proper data that's needed for that negotiation to occur with the actual representation of you in the digital sense, using and actually responding via the appropriate data that's needed for that particular transaction. So it can actually act as a legal entity of you in that transaction without you actually having to be there. So multiple of these digital entities, those digital ambient twins, can actually occur and work on your behalf without you actually having to physically interact with the situation.
That sounds interesting, but it raises a whole slew of questions, starting with the fact that human beings, aren't static. We change, we grow, our tastes change. Sometimes we're fickle. Will digital twins be able to evolve in real time with their human twins?
So this is, again, a very interesting point, and I think there are actually many facets that we are still exploring. I think that outside of specific changes or some of the day-to-day changes that the digital twin needs to be aware of, there are also legal and potentially even regulatory changes that we need to think through. So there are many, many facets that the consortium that we are building is actually looking at. Part of the answer to this is the ability for the environment in which the digital twin is interoperating with the computing or the technology side digital twin is the ability to learn. So as the human and the human's representative is interacting with the digital world, the AI systems are also learning about it. And that data is constantly moved between the digital representation of the human and the environment in which it's interacting. It's constantly moved back and forth, and that transaction is creating new data, new representation. The human actually has the ability to modify the digital twin as well, because we also have to have the interface in order to manage the interaction and manage the representation and the rules, the regulation, and the legal constructs in which that digital twin is operating on our behalf. So from those perspectives, there's constant modification and constant update and constant management of that digital entity that's representing us in the cyber-physical sense. But I also want to touch on some of the legal, maybe even ethical considerations. One of the areas where we had quite a bit of conversation was on the legal and ethical representation of a human, especially after death. So what does it mean for the digital ambient twin representation of that human to continue and represent us after death? Because after the corporal body is dead, it doesn't necessarily mean that our digital entity dies. It actually redefines some of our legal and regulatory constructs on what it means to manage, let's say, our will and last testament after death, or to handle our, handle the representation of our estate during probate. So these are some considerations that are very unique as we are moving forward in the ambient science construct, and we are starting to look at what can happen and what are some of the things that we can continue and how we can manage our life beyond our physical life, and what does that mean in the future.
So in terms of that ability to modify the digital twin, are we kind of talking transhumanism here? Are we talking a direct interface from brain to the digital twin, ultimately, if not initially?
So I don't want to really speculate on science fiction. I think that there are definitely capabilities and facilities that will occur in the future that we cannot yet imagine. The science is moving ahead at leaps and bounds, and the different types of interfaces that we see that are closer to science than science fiction is absolutely mind-boggling. So I would not exclude any interfaces in the future that would even provide a direct brain to computing download or ability to provide a direct interface. I think that's absolutely possible. But I think in the initial sense, as we move into the era of data stewardship, in the era of an ambient object, an ambient digital twin, first we're going to be interfacing with these systems utilizing some of our very rudimentary and 30, 40-year-old technologies, maybe even something as simple as a keyboard. But if we look into AI and some of the learning systems that are starting to represent needs and wants of humans, we're also going to be able to generate new data, metadata about humans and about the interaction and the representation of the digital twin from those learning systems. So I can imagine learning systems that are specifically created to collect the data and create an image of that digital twin that is then reviewed by the human and evaluated for use. I think we have some growing pains to get into this system. And as we move forward, you mentioned, transhumanism, you mentioned some of the cyber-physical interfaces. I absolutely believe that this technology is going to get there.
I mean, all right, it's one thing that our data online is difficult for us to control, and our cell phones may make it possible to be tracked wherever we are. But how does one go off the grid when we've got digital twins? Will it be possible, and will it be possible not just to know where you are, but exactly what you're doing and almost what you're thinking at any time? What have you looked into in terms of the privacy issues?
Oh, I love this question because I think that there is a falsehood that is out there that we actually have a notion of privacy. I believe that privacy and security of data is a falsehood because we are not even aware of the data that is representing us out there today. There's data that's being constantly collected, even unbeknownst to us, by, when you go into a mall, there are security cameras and closed circuit cameras that are watching you. When you are driving around and a police car goes by you, or you're driving by a red light camera, data is being captured about you and your license plate and your location. When you are driving around in that same car, whether or not you actually have Google and Facebook running, they are collecting data about you. And that data is being collected even when your phone is not connected to a network. At the moment you connect to that network, that data is immediately provided. So the concept of a digital twin, I believe, is actually helpful because you can create that digital twin to safeguard your data, even in environments that you are not directly involved with. So you can actually describe the metadata via digital twin to create a privacy through pixelation and directly interface and interact with the mall cameras and the red light cameras on your behalf for that instance while you're in the view of that camera. So your digital twin can interact with that system because you as a human being don't have the ability to do that. So it's actually increasing the privacy and actually connecting the concept of data stewardship, which is the concept of what is your data and what are your rights and value associated with the data about you in the data community, and actually enact the rules and regulations about your data with the appropriate privacy consideration, with the appropriate security on your behalf. Currently, we don't have the ability to do this. So what do we give up? I think we do give up the ability to go off grid. But I also believe that we have already given up that right because we live in a digital society where data about us, data representing us, and data collected either with or without our knowledge is already happening. So I believe that the concept of digital twin and the concept of ambient digital twin is actually enhancing our ability to regain control, regain data control and regain control about our privacy and security at a rate that and at the level that we are unable to do so as regular day-to-day humans.
Okay, for one last thing I'd like to explore with you and ask you if you've thought about, if you've done any studying into a term that has come up frequently when I have had other guests on in regards to robotics, artificial intelligence, voice assistance, etc., is the uncanny valley. The notion that when these systems become almost human-like but not quite, they maybe start to creep us out. Do you think that with a large portion of the population, at least at first, that there might be an uncanny valley effect, if not with ambient science as a whole, maybe with the digital twin?
So I don't think that the digital twin would creep people out because there's no corporal representation. So it's an object, it's a thing that is nothing more than data and information that is put into context. So it doesn't have the same, representation like the I don't remember the robot in Japan that kind of creeps people out because it's a representation of the professor and it looks just like him and acts like him. That's a little bit creepier than just data, because data today is already there. So if you're looking at data representation of you from your credit card, credit services, you already have a data representation. You just have no control over it. So that's the reason I don't think there is a connection to Uncanny Valley.
So just in closing, what do you see time frame? I mean, when will this ambient experience be around us? I know the Internet of Things is more and more enabling it, but it still has to all be connected. So how far away is this?
So in some ways, the work has already began. So if you look at China 2025 or Industry 3.0 or Society 5.0 in Japan, there are efforts already happening and ongoing on actually figuring out the creation of a consistent experience. There are car manufacturers that are looking to, for example, create a consistent experience representing the car company outside of the vehicle. And how does the representation and the experience of that vehicle continue in your day-to-day life? And that effort is already ongoing in Japan. On the other side of it, there are some things that are actually missing. So a key element of this effort is language, a language that is consistent between the human or the representation of the human digital twin and the cyber physical entities. There is no consistent interface language ontology today. There's no semantic ability to actually communicate. So some of the first efforts that I'm focusing on that I think will take, anywhere between 3 to 5 years is to actually create that language. So we have the ability to create and manage the transaction and the experience in a common linguistics, so we can actually negotiate and communicate with the systems around us. So I would say that the concept of ambient and ambient science as a fully realized capability is around 10 to 15 years out.
Kati, thank you so much for your time, and perhaps as this gets a little closer down the road, we'll revisit it again sometime.
I really look forward to that. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you today.
I have to admit that I'm conflicted over the digital twin concept. I understand Kati's point that the lack of any corporeal representation will head off descent into the uncanny valley. I'm just not sure I agree with it. The thought of the mere existence of an invisible, always-on digital representation of myself makes me feel a bit uneasy. Will I be able to control it? Will it be reliable? Will it make decisions it thinks are in my best interests without even consulting me? And of course, there are the ever-present questions of privacy and security. What if it can be hacked? Like self-driving cars, some of us may need a period of getting used to the concept before accepting it. The Uncanny Valley, as well as other issues relevant to these questions, will come up in Seeking Delphi episode number 31, as I welcome back artificial intelligence author John C. Havens to discuss IEEE's first public release of its book-length guidelines for ethical design in autonomous systems. Look for it soon. Thanks again to Katalin Bártfai-Walcott for joining me, and to you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to these programs on YouTube, iTunes, or Player FM. My technical assistant is Mohammed Maroof. Until next time, I'm Mark Sackler.